If doctors told us that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, we would rejoice. We'd feel hope that we could live our lives again, get back to work, back to doing what we want. Well, masks are a ticket to that freedom. We can help protect others and save lives by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Until there's a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on. A message to help keep you safe.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
September 28th, 1972. It's Game 8 of hockey's Summit Series. The best of Canada against the best of the Soviet Union. After 7 games, each side has 3 wins and a tie. In Canada, the entire country is virtually shut down. The nation's cultural identity on the line. As the Soviets pull ahead after 2 periods, 5-3, frustration mounts. During the intermission, the goaltender Ken Dryden says to himself, "In 20 minutes, I will be the most hated man in Canada."
It was the ultimate test of the 2 hockey superpowers.
Those guys were playing with passion. Everybody knew that it's a war.
Now they're pointing at each other back to the net. Lee is totally incensed at this call.
2 hostile economic and political systems. Capitalism versus communism.
We're not going to lose. No way we're going to lose.
This was for the prestige of the country. We are the world champions.
I was like a man possessed.
Going at it, they're not
the Cold War, the us against them attitude was exactly what this turned out to be.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, here we go. Once again, how are you doing, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and you, of course, have found Good Seats Still Available. Thank you for finding us. It's the curious little podcast, as you know, that is devoted to, on a weekly basis, what used to be in professional sports. Hope you're doing well for the holiday season. Hope everything is going okay. You're staying healthy, you're staying safe, and staying sane. Those are all hard things to do these days, but we're with you here to maybe distract you a little bit, and let's go back to a time in sports history, and we spin the wheel around into the early 1970s, and as that little intro clip may have given you a hint, we're going to hockey and to Canada in particular. This is a fascinating and fun conversation that we had this week with our guest, Rich Bendell, who has written not the only book devoted to this topic. That is the 1972 Summit Series between Team Canada and the then national team of the Soviet Union, the USSR, back when it was the Soviet Union. I must tell you that not only is this book sort of a compendium, frankly, of this amazing series that happened throughout the month of September 1972. If you're not from Canada, you may not understand the gravity and the significance and the cultural phenomenon that was this Summit Series. And that clip that you heard was from a wonderful and tremendously done 2012 documentary that was on NBC Sports Network. The narration, of course, by the well-known Peter Coyote. Fantastic voice. You've heard him on lots of different things. From Flagstaff Films and Ross Greenberg Productions. It was called Cold War on Ice, Summit Series 72. And as you'll hear in our conversation with with Rich in just a few moments. He, the author, by the way, of the 1972 Summit Series, Canada versus the USSR, Stats, Lies, and Videotape, the untold story of hockey's series of the century. Yes, you can call it that. The hyperbole is earned and perhaps maybe even undersold. And I will tell you, I'll be honest, this is something that was relatively unknown to me. And I fancy myself as being somewhat hip to at least stuff that was going on in the 70s regarding sports. But, obviously a lot of teams and leagues we focus on this little show, but also events, things that in the professional sports realm sort of came and went. And this is certainly one of them, and a spectacle at that. And its origins, frankly, are relatively humble. We'll get into the entire story, and we've got some great clips embedded in there and stuff. And if you are a Canadian hockey fan of any sort, whether today or previous generations or somewhere in between, you will undoubtedly know this story and perhaps be well versed in it. It's truly one of those things, not unlike the Winter Olympics of 1980, when the United States defeated the Soviet Union for the gold medal. With the Soviet Union, but also winning ultimately the gold medal in hockey, right? It was kind of one of those events of like, where were you when, right? Those games were going on. This is exactly that, but in Canadian form, just a mere 8 years earlier. The humble beginnings of this story, as we'll get into, it really kind of just revolves around amateur hockey, right? Somewhat, a passion certainly in Canada. Certainly in the then Soviet Union, now Russia. But it was not sort of best understood. You have to understand this is during the time of the Cold War, communism versus freedom and, democracy and things like it. But against that backdrop is sort of frankly, the ultimate hard conversation about which team and which country is better at the professional version of hockey. And in the early 70s, not quite known. I mean, the amateur game was certainly being dominated by the Soviet Union at the time, to the point where Canada wasn't even participating anymore. It was such just a long-lasting sort of run that the Soviet teams had won just about everything in amateur hockey. But, it was always sort of that saving grace, that sort of belief that, when it really came to the professional game, well, Canadians can't be beaten, right? Because it's the origin sport, if you will, the national sport of Canada. And, if only the Soviets could challenge us or play us in a professional realm, well, we'd show them a thing or two. Well, that's a bit of sort of the background of how this sort of came about. And I'll let Rich kind of let you, understand the sort of story. If you know this story and this amazing month of September 1972, when the entire country of Canada, and frankly, it was also in the United States too, there were a lot of hockey cities that had access to these games via the syndication, or I think it was on various PBS stations, frankly, especially the games in Moscow, the latter 4 games. But this was an 8-game series that was essentially set up as an exhibition. And it became very quickly and very forcefully much, much more. So by the time of the end of it, it was literally a titular battle for the world supremacy in the sport of hockey. That's how much it grew in importance over that short span of time. And it's a fascinating and amazingly interesting story, most of which was completely unknown to me. And I am just thrilled to have this conversation this week with our guest, Rich Bendell. He, the author of the Summit Series, the Untold Story of Hockey's Series of the Century. It's a hoot. It's the proverbial scratching of the surface, for sure. There are many, many books have been written about it, a bunch of documentaries and stuff, but please enjoy this conversation with Rich, which if it's an entree to an amazing story for you to learn more, I am happy to be the gateway to your learning of such an amazing and just an incredible story. All right. Before we get there, let's give you some holiday goodness. We'll give you a whole bunch of promo codes here. We know the holidays are not yet finished. If you're in the midst of celebrating Hanukkah, hopefully those lights and those gifts are going well your way. If you're waiting for Kwanzaa or the Christmas holiday, obviously gift giving is still very much in your mindset. And hell, look, if you're just looking to kind of get yourself a little gift just because you had a tough year, well, look, get your pen and papers ready because all of these great sites have great promo codes for you as well to save some bucks as you buy your holiday items, whether for yourself or your friends or your family. Here goes. 417 Helmets, collectible helmets and more. That's 417-417helmets.com. Promo code Good Seats. 10% off all of your purchases. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. That's the place to get all of your memorabilia and then some from teams and leagues no longer with us. Promo code Good Seats at SportsHistoryCollectibles.com for 15% off all of your purchases. Our new friends at Ebbets Field Flannels, the granddaddy of them all. That's my nickname for them. Ebbets.com, EBBETS. Ebbets.com. You know how good their stuff is. Promo code there to save 10% off. Good Seats 10, the number 10. Good Seats 10. Oldschoolshirts.com. P.F. Wilson, Cincinnati, Ohio, and friends. Great t-shirts, not only from old sports leagues and teams, but all kinds of pop culture artifacts of your commemorated in t-shirt form. Promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases there. How about Streaker Sports? Streakersports.com, the purveyors of sports culture. Great shirts, great other paraphernalia and outerwear, and not just sports teams and leagues, but all kinds of cultural overlays with sports. Promo code there for you at streakersports.com. Good Seats, 15% off all of the purchases there. And last but not least, our pal Dustin Alameda in Portland, Oregon. 503 Sports, the king of throwbacks. 503-sports.com. Don't forget the dash. Promo code for you there, Seats, SEATS, 10% off all of your purchases at 503 Sports. Thank you, one, and thank you all. And we appreciate you giving them all a try, a look, hopefully a purchase or two. And we hope that we've helped solve some of your shopping problems this holiday season. And lots more goodness to come in the realm of commerce in the new year for sure. All right, I am done shilling. And now let's get onto the ice, shall we? With our new pal, Rich Bendell, as we talk about the amazing story. I mean, you could not have scripted this series any better than the Summit series of 1972. Here we go. Please, as always, enjoy. You know, hockey has certainly been something we've gone around and around on for lots of different episodes. Obviously, the Great Expansion and the WHA and, all kinds of sort of stories and whatnot. But clearly, me growing up in the United States as a kid in the late 60s, early 70s, I was sort of very vaguely aware of sort of not only the NHL's growth, the WHA's arrival, but also sort of this series kind of thing that seemed to constantly come back, I guess, and being reminded of it, especially when the Olympics came up, right? Because a lot of the sort of reminiscences, I guess, about Canada and USSR and all that kind of stuff sort of came back and back. It's like I didn't have any sort of understanding about even what that was prior, right? So that's why this is really interesting to me. Well,
it's if you may be surprised to hear, some of the best reactions I got when my book came out was from Americans. I still remember the first time I was at the Toronto Expo they have for cards and, all kinds of hockey memorabilia. And one fellow, I had my book set up, and he stopped, and he goes, I know what that is. And he comes over, and he's like, I end up finding out, I think it was from North Carolina. And he's like, this is great, and I learned all about this series. Canadians, oddly enough, I think it's been more of a tough slog in the sense that they feel that they've heard about the series for so long that they know it inside out. And funny enough, I think people who maybe are not as familiar with the series maybe a little bit more receptive to the fact that, hey, there's something new out there that hopefully brings an interesting perspective on it, and maybe information that maybe it contradicts myths to a degree, but it's all based on facts. Like, I didn't, kind of just make it up in my own mind. It was done on research and trying to figure out, because to a large degree, I don't think the series, every book I ever read on the series basically talked about it as if it was a singular event with no prior or, I think people recognize the after, but the one question that nobody seemed to ask is, why was there a series? How did it come to be? What were the circumstances? And that part was really fascinating, because as you start to piece it together, you find that some of I call them the myths about, we knew nothing about the Soviets. It's not quite true. There was actually quite a bit of information. I just don't know if people paid attention to it.
Well, let's set the table a little bit. Let's put it frame it, because especially for our non-Canadian listeners, right? I don't think people sort of fully understand this series, to your point, why it existed in the first place. Maybe you can kind of sort of frame this, because it feels to me like this was, a very pitched battle between the two arguably superpowers, if you will, in the sport of hockey. But this doesn't sort of just magically appear and plop down in 1972 out of thin air. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a background, and maybe also draw us into how you personally sort of became interested in this topic as well, because I think you were a kid around this time, right?
I was pretty young, and some of the players who I've had an opportunity to meet have been surprised that, A, that I even remembered it, and B, that I remembered it so well. Exactly as you say, framing, I guess, the series, literally you kind of go back in time to the 1920 Summer Olympics, funny enough, when hockey came into the Olympics. And Canada dominated the sport very much. It ended up moving to the winter, which only makes sense, of course. But Canada was kind of the standard bearer for decades. And then the Soviets, funny enough, it was Stalin's son who introduced ice hockey to the nation. For whatever reason, I think he had been over in England at some point in time and became interested in the game, and decided, as opposed to bandy, which is kind of like, in a sense, ice hockey, soccer on a soccer-sized rink with the curve stick and all that. He wanted
still played actively in places like Kazakhstan and those kinds of places too, I believe.
Exactly, and they knew the sport in a sense, but on a different scale. And he basically said, we're going to learn how to play ice hockey just after World War II ended. And so they quickly, if you can imagine, within 8 years, they went from literally picking up a hockey stick for the first time to beating Canada in the World Hockey Championships that year, which is the first year they ever played. To say it was shocking would be, an understatement, because Canada was we were the leading nation, and who is this upstart, coming in here and not only giving us a game, but trouncing us. And funny enough, I'm not sure if you were familiar with the game, but they won 7-2, which is simply ironic. So all of a sudden you had a pitched battle. The next year we wanted to beat them, and we did, but slowly but surely the Soviet, became the prime hockey power in amateur hockey, because Canada, as with the NHL, pros weren't allowed to play in the Olympics or the World Hockey Championships. In some cases, players could get reinstated for World Hockey, but pretty much we had to send, if you can imagine our, the hockey development system, the best of the best were going into the NHL or their farm system. It was other players, university, senior hockey, things like that, who were available to us to challenge the best in the world. And that worked for a while. But as the end of the 50s happened and we rolled into the 60s, we could compete, but we no longer really had a chance of winning at that level. So what ended up happening is in the 60s, the Soviets went on a 9-year run, consecutive run, gold medals in the World Hockey Championships and the Olympics. So in many ways, the Summit Series this was going to be the opportunity for Canada to show that our pros, our best players, are still the best in the world. And that kind of led to the pitched battle that was the 8-game Summit Series.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction here because I think it's even sort of already sort of we're losing sort of the grip, I think, generationally about people sort of losing an understanding of the old Soviet Union and the process by which even the United States was competing, the amateur sort of level, right, where, if only pros, I think there's a whole generation of people who think, for example, that pros have always been able to play basketball, for example, right? And, the dream team and all that stuff. But it wasn't the case all the way through, the 80s and early 90s. But that's an important sort of part of all of this, right? Because this series in 72 was designed to be the battle royale, I guess, on the professional circuit. And I guess this was sort of a desire by both countries, oddly, to kind of get to that sort of pro versus pro thing, to kind of, sort of like in a grand boxing match, the battle to end all battles, right? How does this even sort of come about? Because I got to think, yeah, certainly the Canadians were, angling to kind of, really kind of throw their best players at the Soviets, but I can't imagine the Soviets per se wanting to necessarily, interrupt this sort of perceived dominance, at least at the amateur level.
It's a good point. And to a degree, there was, I think, competing interests. It's nice to be kind of considered number one, but ultimately there's always an asterisk about it because it's like, hey, you're not playing Canada's pro players, therefore, how can you call yourselves the best? And I think the Russians themselves kind of realized in order to continue progressing their game and elevating it, they'd kind of reached a point, I guess they'd self-realize, hey, we're up to 9 championships in a row, but we're starting to stagnate. And in fact, one of the ironies of the 72 series is they actually lost the 72 World Hockey Championships. In many years prior to that, in an Olympic year, because 72 was also an Olympic year, they only had one or the other. And if you won the Olympics, then you were world champion. But 72 was, I think, the first year where they actually had Olympics and then a World Hockey Championships. So they did win in Sapporo, Japan. And in fact, the U.S. came in a surprise second that year. And then in the spring, they played, and the Czechoslovakia actually defeated them and won gold over them. So that was kind of, I think, a reaffirmation for them. We need to challenge ourselves more, and to do that, we have to play Canada. So as funny as it seems, I think they wanted to, they were ready for it. They've been preparing again since they'd won in 54. They were ready. They figured, we want to find out how good we are against Canada's best. And they were prepared to lose to do it, but I don't think they went into it without the intent of believing they could win.
Well, okay, so I read certain sort of narratives about this. Who do you think wanted this series more? I would think it would be Canada, but when I read a lot of sort of some of the background, the intimation seems to be that it was the Soviets that kind of wanted to make the case. Do I have that right, or is it speculative as to sort of who and how it came about?
Well, I would say, as we've discovered over, again, when the Soviet Union existed, the Russians, not to be impolite, but they can be pretty cagey. They don't always, they're card players to a degree. They don't want people to know how much they might want or not want something. They knew the Canadian public wanted it. There was a great desire for quite a few years prior to the series. I found different articles. I found references, I think maybe even in the NHL 1970 All-Star Game, of all things, how they were talking about how Canada, wanted to play, the pros, having the pros play against the Soviets. The players themselves probably didn't feel quite the same way, but the Canadian government as well felt the same way, because we didn't want to be embarrassed on the world stage, and the rules were we felt things were kind of stacked against us. There's a number of things that happened in international hockey in the 60s, for example, where we felt we got shortchanged and disadvantaged. So I think it really was the Soviets knew we wanted to play, and they did too, but they didn't want us to know how much they wanted to. So they negotiated basically for the series. They negotiated as much in their favor as possible. And I guess that makes sense. For example, they didn't allow any NHL referees in the 72 series. There were actually American referees for the 4 games in Canada, and then it was a mix of different Czechs and West German referees and a Swede as well that were of varying levels of quality. Let me just leave it at that.
Well, you mentioned the 1970 NHL All-Star Game, and you also sort of call that out in the book. It almost feels like that was sort of a hint, I guess, perhaps of the idea of having country versus country, sort of in some way, shape, or form. Maybe almost an impromptu, maybe template for what would happen 2 years later.
I would say that's a really accurate statement, and even when Canada still had our Canadian national team, we had wanted to start migrating near pros, they call them, like players who were in NHL club systems, but not quite, on regular on the NHL teams. And we had received approval in the fall of '69 to allow said players to play for the first World Hockey Championships that were originally planned in Canada, Winnipeg and Montreal in 1970. But what happened is it kind of kept getting bandied about, and the Soviets, I think, tested us. They actually allowed the Nats to bring 10 near pros to their Sovietsky Sport tournament. That's an August-September tournament they always have, and it still exists today. And the Nats did very well, Canadian national team. And I think they started to get worried that this wasn't such a good idea. And then they also had what they called their Christmas Vestia tournament, an invite tournament. And Canada, again, brought around 10 near pros, and we finished second. And funny enough, a couple weeks later, it was kind of announced that, these near pros would not be allowed in the World Hockey Championships of 1970. And Canada withdrew and said, if this is the game you're going to play, we're not going along with it anymore. And basically said, until we are allowed to use pros, we're not going to participate. So funny enough, the 72 series, in 72, if hockey fans can imagine, there was no international hockey of any kind that involved Canada. At that time, there weren't any World Juniors. We obviously weren't participating in the World Hockey Championships, not the Olympics. There was no, women's hockey, no sledge hockey. Literally, there was no international hockey in 1972. So this was also a tournament that allowed us to get back into the mix, and it was across the board. There was like multiple interests, Money was a big incentive for everybody. But at the end of the day, it was like, who's the best? Let's find out once and for all. You get to ice your best players, we get to ice ours. But funny enough, it didn't turn out that way because, as you mentioned about the WHA, the new league that started that year, we actually lost some players from our team because they were essentially not allowed to play for Canada, even though they were Canadians, because they had jumped this rival league. So we iced a very good team, but we didn't ice our very best, if I can leave it at that.
Well, all right, let's frame that before we sort of get into the actual foundation of this actual series and sort of its how it sort of unfolded. I think it's important to kind of circle 1972 on a number of on another level, right? Because this is also, this is a couple of years removed from the great expansion of the NHL. In 67, and obviously literally doubling in size that year, and recognizing that there's a sort of a great big continent in both countries to sort of dominate after sticking with 6 teams for God knows 40 years almost.
Exactly.
Right, and then this WHA thing, which we've We've had the pleasure of talking to its founder, Dennis Murphy, on a couple of occasions, believe it or not. Still kicking it at 90, I think 95 years old, God bless.
Very cool. Yeah.
Right? But it certainly shows that there's an appetite growing, right, for the professional game in both countries here in this hemisphere. And I don't know. I'm just wondering. So maybe you can sort of explain sort of this little rift, because we haven't mentioned him by name yet, but Bobby Hull, right, being the biggest name signed away in this new fledgling, not even sort of puck dropped yet, WHA. Exactly. He's not going to be allowed to play in this series. Why is that? Like, why, if it's Canadian professionals, why not WHA in that mix? I'm guessing it's because it was perceived that there's a bit of renegade, or perhaps, or the NHL had a lock on this series to bring players into. Help us set that tone a bit.
Oh, for sure. There's several, I guess, elements to it, and a critical element actually is probably the one that scuttled it. But I guess in summary, the NHL absolutely did not like the idea of a rival league competing with them. They were undergoing dramatic expansion, and they even added 2 more teams for that upcoming season to kind of in New York for the Islanders and Atlanta to block out the WHA. So they were not interested at all in doing anything that would promote their competitor. But there was another overriding aspect to it, and that, you had Canada obviously wanted Bobby Hull, who was one of the biggest stars of his time and still is. And Canada obviously wanted to have him on the team as fans, and even Harry Sinden, who was making up the team. He was going to select him. But the NHL, I think there was 2 sides to it. One is they didn't like the fact that Bobby Hull was embarrassing them in a sense by leaving the league. You're losing a star player. They also, and this is a lesser known sidebar to everything, which is there was an insurance element. The NHL, under no circumstances, was going to insure a huge $2 million contract to Bobby Hull, because as you can imagine, his contract actually made him an insurance risk. And the WHA wasn't really in a position to insure him either. So for the Summit Series, the Team Canada players, they did get an insurance policy. And as you can imagine, all the best players of the NHL would total up a pretty fair sum of money even back then. But Bobby Hull was kind of like, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to take on this risk? What if, God forbid, what if Bobby Hull were to break his leg playing in one of these games and his career be over? So there was several elements to it. But I guess summing it up, the NHL didn't want to promote their rival. They had no interest in, insuring somebody. And technically the series itself was under Hockey Canada. The NHL was not directly involved, say, in the organization of it, but obviously they were supplying the players, and that was their concern. If anything happens to our high-priced talent, who's going to pay the bill for that? And nobody really was willing to. Hockey Canada was fairly new; they didn't have the resources. The WHA wasn't going to do it, and the NHL certainly wasn't going to. So I think in the end, unfortunately, for Bobby Hull especially, because he did want to play, was that it was a series of circumstances that no one, was willing to kind of bridge that gap.
Interesting. And Bobby Orr, still in the NHL, he was out with a knee injury, so he couldn't play either. So already not looking great for the talent pool, I guess, that one would want to draw to this Team Canada.
Absolutely. The 72 series is so interesting from many different angles, and the one being, what if Canada had arguably 2 of its greatest players playing for them? And Bobby Hull could play. He was healthy, he was available, but again, due to the circumstances beyond his control and Sinden's, he wasn't an option. Bobby Orr, actually, he had his surgery, I think, around the second week of June. and he just wasn't ready. He in fact came out for the scrimmages. He showed up, I think, about a week into camp, around the third week of August. But his knee kept kind of swelling, and he had fluid on the knee, and it was just too soon. He wanted to play. He continued to travel with the team, and I have a picture of him practicing in Moscow. He was still trying, and there was even speculation Sundin was going to put him in the lineup for Game 8, but he realized that one Orr would probably be very limited, and even if, say, he wanted to play on the power play, he wouldn't be able to play him in the game. First of all, he hadn't even played a game at that point, and it'd be unfair to ask him to step into Game 8 and try and, be the star. So Bobby Orr was there, but his knee wasn't healed enough, and in fact, I think he didn't return to the NHL till the first week in November. That's how severe his recovery was. So you're absolutely right. From Canada's perspective, we would have loved to have had them on the team, and many believe that the series would not have ended up as close as it did if they could have played.
All right, give us a sense of how this was set up, the hype, how it was released to the public, the idea of it, the build up to it. It ran 8 games, but what was it even envisioned as an 8-game series? I mean, why would you have an even amount of games and all that kind of stuff? How and maybe even the timing of it, like how was this all sort of framed and set up and hyped, I guess?
A lot of good questions. Try and answer them as succinctly as possible. The NHL was loath to interrupt their season. They understood that there'd be a disadvantage. The Soviet players were known to, if not train year-round, they certainly trained upwards of 10 months a year. But the NHL really didn't want to have some special international series with Team Canada, like being pulled out of the league, all those players related to Team Canada, and then interrupting the season for gosh knows how long. I mean, the way it was scheduled was a month. And the idea was we'll start off early September, run for 2 weeks, break for 2 weeks, and then, play for a week, break for 2 weeks, and then restart again. And in essence, everything happened over 4 weeks, which is quite a period of time. So it was seen that the only, timing that could work would be would normally be training camp for the players. As to the conditions of the tournament, that was all decided in the spring as those World Hockey Championships were happening in 1972, and it was finally agreed upon, yes, we're going to have this tournament. I think it was felt to be fair, 4 games here, 4 games there. It wasn't kind of seen as a 7-game winner-take-all series. It was actually meant to be a friendly exhibition, if you can imagine it. It was expected to be competitive, but nobody, I think, foresaw that it would turn into the pitch battle right to almost to the final second that it turned out to be. So again, you had the two parties that finally came together. It was Hockey Canada and the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association kind of negotiating. There was a little competition going on, structure-wise, and the Soviets got the deal they wanted, and then it took on a life of its own. During the summer, usually hockey news, literally the hockey news, became very quiet because, there wasn't a lot going on. This is probably the first time ever where hockey became like daily news, especially once the team was picked in July. So it just fever pitched from there. Almost like every day there's more articles, more interviews, more interest. And then by the time you got to September 2nd, first game in Montreal, it was almost like, you had powder keg and match type of thing. Everyone was ready.
Yeah, and not only the selection of the team, but the naming of the team, calling it Team Canada, which I guess was Alan Eagleson's idea, or I also understand there was an ad agency sort of involved. Now, Alan Eagleson is a whole other can of worms there, and one which we opened up with our pal Dan Bouchard in a previous episode. I digress on that, and I encourage our listeners to listen to that episode, all 2 hours of it, because that's a whole sort of intriguing tale and saga in and of itself. But suffice to say, Allen's part of this mix during this time. But it almost feels like this. I'm just wondering how this hype sort of developed. Was it sort of organic, or was it? Because this is also, again, people of this current generation sort of remember, this is also during the height, if you will, of what was known as the Cold War, right? Where it was sort of, the Iron Curtain of this sort of mystical and mysterious and evil almost Soviet Union, and a free country in Canada, arguably one of the better, if not the best, hockey playing nation on the planet. That just seems like it's ready-made for press and or hype.
Absolutely, and I think organic is a perfect description. It literally grew almost like a seed. And again, I would go back to 1954. The Soviets show up at their first World Hockey Championships and completely embarrass Canada. And then we come back the next year and beat them, and then they defeat us. Defeat every country in the 1956 Olympics. So you have this rivalry, simmering rivalry, building pretty quickly, and then as it kind of, the end of the 50s happens, in amongst that time period was the 1957 tour, where a Soviet team of kind of Soviet stars came over and played a number of Canada's senior teams and a few junior teams. And that was well received. It actually received, I think the first game was in Toronto in Maple Leaf Gardens, and it was, funny enough, ended up 7-2. The Soviets scored the first two goals, and then I'm trying to think which team it was. Whitby Dunlops ended up scoring 7 straight goals, and this was broadcast on national TV in like November of 1957. So you just saw all of these developments happening. It was like one step at a time up this hill. And again, I think that's where the term summit kind of came from, that each step upwards was leading to the great confrontation. And even though nobody really thought of it necessarily in that terms, like you say, there's the political side of things. The Soviet Union was this big, mysterious country that seemed, we didn't know what they were up to. And when they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1969, that only added to kind of this fear element that they wanted to take over the world. Here they are invading a country and bringing tanks in there and doing so against that country's will. So, every element you can imagine, there's the democracy versus communism element. You've got the amateur versus pro hockey element. You've got literally Canada being, considered the birthplace of hockey, and the Soviet Union wanting to become the world power in hockey. So all of these were, I guess the word I'd use is convergence. All of these things were converging together, and it just, it was timing. 72 just seemed to be the right timing. The Soviets wanted it. We wanted it. The hockey public wanted it. And they made it happen, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. And I think once the team was selected in Canada, the interest just kept growing, like literally by day, because everyone wanted to know who got picked, why somebody didn't get picked. Bobby Hull was quite a controversial thing, because the Prime Minister of Canada, who happened to be Pierre Trudeau at that time, who happens to be Justin Trudeau's father, our current Prime Minister, he actually asked the NHL to let Bobby Hull play. So you had unprecedented things happening that had never been seen before, and it just carried on through right from beginning to end of the series.
Well, it also appears to me that the Canadian press, the Western press, the hockey intelligentsia were, almost super confident, I guess, that Canada, or maybe uninformed, perhaps, that Canada would not only do pretty well in this quote-unquote exhibition series, but it looked like there was even speculation that, could the Russians even win a game? And so I'm wondering, as it's almost like a Rocky movie, right? It's sort of like the hype and the pomp and the circumstance. Like, it almost feels to me like there's sort of a combination in this prelude to this series, that the sort of this confidence, I guess, with a bit of folks sort of questioning maybe whether Canada is going to do as well as everybody thinks they're going to, but almost maybe also, frankly, some sandbagging perhaps by the Soviets, kind of not letting on perhaps as to how well they are? Or do you think that they were truly unaware perhaps of how well they could perform? I can't really tell by reading sort of some of the history, but the Soviets certainly were probably pretty cunning and sort of knew how to sort of strategically maybe set themselves up too. So I wouldn't put him past the Russian authorities, right, to perhaps undersell their capabilities and perhaps surprise a few folks along the way. What's your perception of sort of the reality check between these two teams and their beliefs and how they could perform in such a series?
Well, I think on the NHL side of things, you just had this absolute, belief that there's no way our team can lose, that an amateur team of any sort would be able to beat the best pros in hockey. I think there was overconfidence to a degree, and it probably actually feasted on itself as all the players came together, because they were, I think admittedly a lot of the players were in awe of some of the guys on the team, some of the younger players, seeing Frank Mahovlich being there and, Phil Esposito and believing, how could we possibly lose? Even though Bobby Hull's not here and even though Bobby Orr's not here, we still have, all-star players. We still have, legendary figures. So I think without a doubt on the Canadian side, there was a level of overconfidence. But funny enough, I think a lot of it was the media. I think I've heard fans being interviewed. I've read different articles, and the fans themselves were, I think, split. They felt that, yes, we were going to win, but I think it's going to be tougher than everybody's saying. When you look at some of the comments, and I'll just give an example in the Hockey News, Alan Eagleson, of course, said, we're winning 8-0. Yet Gordie Howe saying, we're going to win, but I think if we're going to have a problem, it'll be the first game or two, because NHL players condition themselves to reach their peak a month or month and a half into the season, that they're not used to hitting their peak so early. So here's a player's perspective that, hey, we're going to have some challenges on our side. One of the best comments was actually Murray Williamson, the U.S. 72 Olympic coach, and he said, I think he summed it up from that, that independent perspective, which is often, the best one, I'd say. He goes, they're playing right into the Russian hands. While the Canadians will be just completing training camps, the Russians will be at their peak. They'll probably have started their camp in late July, a month before the Canadians, and probably have 15 to 20 games under their belts by the time the teams meet. So there's absolutely, you've got these two dynamics, which is NHL players, they were, they appreciated the honor of being chosen for Team Canada, but they weren't necessarily, thrilled about it. A lot of them had, had summer jobs. Even then, they didn't get the pay they get today. They held things like summer skating and hockey camps, and they made a lot of money from that. And so they had to give up lucrative, endorsements, and to a degree have their camps interrupted. So the players themselves probably felt, to a degree, this is more of an inconvenience. Hey, we're glad to play, but really, it's not first thing on my list, right? I'd like to enjoy my summer. So you had the media being overconfident. You had players who, this is brand new. This has never, ever happened before. Never, ever they had to gather and have a camp for, several weeks in preparation of a tournament that started in September. Completely different mindset. Today, it's through the hockey, through the Canada Cups and the World Cups of hockey, it's become the norm, I guess. Back then, it wasn't the norm. It had never happened before. On the Soviet side, they were very glad to be KG. They were very glad to let us be overconfident, to say, we're going to beat them by a goal or two every game. But they were frantically preparing behind the scenes because they felt that they were in tough. Different comments I've read, they really didn't know how it was going to go, but they were going to give it their best shot. And they had been self-evaluating for quite a few years. One book I read, I believe his name was Mayorov, and he was kind of an evaluator of Soviet hockey, a key figure, and had been a good player in their system. And he even, did this analysis measuring, stick handling ability, skating, goaltending. And then even in 1969, he felt that they had the edge in many categories over Canadian players. So don't kid yourself. They were ready. They were as ready as they could be, and they didn't know what was going to happen. But they didn't want us to know that they were as ready for us, and we weren't for them. If that kind of sums things up.
Yeah. Well, it also feels like there's a bit of innocence / naivete, perhaps, right? Because this sort of word of professional, I think, almost feels like a convenient, badge of courage, I guess, or confidence, right? Because, as a kid growing up watching, various Soviet and then Russian teams in the Olympics, for example, it was sort of ingrained and sort of pounded into one's head when listening to the broadcasters that essentially these were pros because in that Soviet system, right, they're basically being paid by the government to be effectively professionals, despite this sort of amateur label, right? So it's really odd, I guess, looking back, and maybe, hindsight is always 20/20, right? But, to think that, oh, hey, we're the best in the professional and we're going to prove it, says Canada. But the reality is that, for the last decade prior, right, every amateur competition, the Soviets were dominating, right? So that's an interesting maybe word parsing there that kind of maybe plays a role perhaps in some confidence building, maybe improperly placed.
And it kind of comes from, I guess, expectations. It comes from being told that you're the best. And not that any of the NHL players, I think, were sitting around at night going, I'm the best player in the world, or I'm one of the best. They just knew that because they could only play against other NHL players. They had nothing to kind of standard bear against how good am I, and vice versa. The European players, they were very anxious to see how they measured up, I guess is the right word. And I think for a lot of the younger listeners, it was so different back then. We got our news literally by reading the news. You had to pick up a newspaper. You had to get the hockey news. You couldn't kind of do a search on the internet. You couldn't watch game footage of people that, from around the world. These things just didn't exist. The Soviet players themselves, except for when we saw them periodically at World Hockey Championships and Olympics, assuming they were being broadcast, we knew almost nothing about them. And to try and explain to somebody that this particular player, like Harlamov, for example, is an outstanding player. Oh, sure he is in international hockey. But you're right. There was also the realization that, they were called shamateurs because they were as dedicated to playing hockey, and maybe even more so than the NHL. I mean, when you had the Soviets training, and I think at that time it was not year-round, but it was more like 10 months out of the year, which is pretty substantial. And NHL players, their season ran, went into training camp sometime in September, and most were done by the end of April, unless you made it to the Stanley Cup final. So you had, maybe May, June, July, August, at least 4 months of the year where, you were enjoying life, enjoying the summer, doing other jobs, those kinds of things. So some of the players realized they're perhaps more professional than we are because of the amount of time they dedicate to hockey. Not that the NHL was second rate in that regard, but it was just the way the Soviets ran things. When you became part of their Soviet national team, you were, I don't know what the right word is exactly, but you were a slave to it in a sense.
Yeah, or in mafia terms, you were made.
You were made.
Right, in separate respects. All right. Well, so let's get into some of the series. I mean, we could probably do an episode for each and every game. That's just how significant and culturally built up this was, especially for the Canadian populace. But September 2nd, 1972, the first of what were going to be 4 games spread across Canada, right? So maybe you can kind of walk us through some of those games. And I guess it's probably important to kind of just maybe set the tone with the first game in Montreal. I think that Canadian confidence was challenged pretty quickly, wasn't it?
It was a game of many faces. And the reason I say that is the game itself was incredibly unique because before NHL games, you know, the teams came out, they had a warm-up, they dropped the puck, and they played. The Summit Series had this huge opening pregame ceremony that lasted almost 30 minutes, if you can imagine. So the players who were geared up to, you know, start at the drop of the puck at 8 o'clock, they didn't start for half an hour.
Now, the representative of the Soviet delegation, Mr. Georgy Rigulsky, will join Mr. Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, and Mr. Charles A., President of Hockey Canada. The capitaines des deux équipes, captains of both teams, will now meet the Prime Minister. For le Canada, for Russia rather, for la Russie, Mr. Pushkin, Mr. Ragulin, and Mr. Vikolov will meet with the Prime Minister along with Jean Rattel, Phil Esposito, and Frank Mahovlich.
I can't recall any game that I've ever been at where you can just feel the tension and it keeps building up, and it's very warm in the Forum tonight, and at the same time the fans are really on their toes. They hardly can wait to see the beginning of this game. There's the official face-off.
They were introduced, there was all the pomp and pageantry and all that. By the time the game actually started, it was early September. It was pretty warm for that time of year. I think it was well over 80 degrees in the building. So you can just imagine these players were melting. They were hot. They were over anxious. Started off great. We scored in the first 30 seconds. Then we scored again a few minutes later. We're up 2-0. But the players on the bench were even talking amongst themselves that these guys are good. They were saying, you hit them, it was like hitting a brick wall. They were so solid. They skated like the wind, and they moved the puck in a way that the NHL players, and this will speak to some of the lack of preparation. They didn't know how the Soviet players were going to play. It was not something that was covered very well in camp. So when the Soviet players would pass the puck more, they call it east-west instead of going north-south up and down the rink. They were using the rink all over the place, and if they didn't like what they saw, they turned around and went back. You didn't do that in the NHL. You know, it was always skate forward and go to the other end and, you know, crash, bang, you know, charge. The Canadian players they quickly found out once the Soviets got their first goal, tied the game, that this was going to be a very long series. And what turned out, you know, what started out wonderfully and looked like it was going to be the cakewalk everyone was expecting, suddenly turned on its ear. And it was a very close game up until about just over 10 minutes left. We scored a goal to make it 4-3. In this series, they used the international rules, which had been when games were outside. So to take away the disadvantage of a team, say, facing the sun, in the third period, they would halt play after 10 minutes and switch ends. So that happened, and we were close. We were, you know, trying to tie the game, and then it all fell apart. And literally, they scored several quick goals, and it turned into a debacle. And we lost 7-3, a national embarrassment. So there were a lot of mistakes made that game, a lot of things that were learned, but it shocked everybody. It was an utter, the players couldn't believe it, the fans couldn't believe it, and the press had a field day, as you can imagine. So that's kind of the way the series started off. We were supposed to win 8-0, according to some experts, and now it almost looked like were we going to win a game? So
was there a little controversy at the end of the game that Team Canada didn't even shake the hands of the Soviets after the game?
Yes, unfortunately, the players themselves hadn't been notified of any post-game, handshakes. So a lot of them were, you can imagine they've just lost. They're in complete shock. They're upset. They're angry, and they're going to their dressing rooms. And then somebody says, "Go back out on the ice. You're supposed to shake hands." It was embarrassing.
So it wasn't on purpose. They did it sort of unwittingly. Okay. But that probably added a little extra drama, maybe unwittingly, no?
It did, because the Soviet players are standing there ready and waiting to do so. And the Canadian players, unfortunately, some of them had already gone to the room, removed their jerseys and that, and it was just kind of seen as it's too late now. So it was a bit of an embarrassment, but the players themselves, they didn't know. And I'm not even sure if the coaches knew. It just, again, here's a series that's never been done before. Nobody knows all the protocols, and or maybe somebody assumed they knew the protocols. And we usually, we know what happens when somebody assumes, right? So the first game, it just across the board, fans felt embarrassed, the team felt embarrassed. We knew we were in for a tough series, and we'd only gone through one of 8 games.
So what happens 2 days later in Toronto? The press, as well as the reaction of the coaches and the players, looks like there was a pretty dramatic shift in the roster. It looks like that people really, if there was any notion that this was going to be an exhibition series that was sort of gently played amongst two countries just trying to showcase talent, it obviously started to take on some more urgency, I guess, from the Canadian side for sure.
Very good point. Some of the player selections were based on how players had done in the the scrimmage games. There were 5 of those between Team Canada, red and white, and then they had 3 intra-squad games. So they kind of went with the players that gave what appeared to be the best effort, and that's a reasonable thing to do. But looking at the changes they made for Game 2, you could see that there was quite a few players that, looking back, you would say, well, they should have been in there from the beginning, and that'd be a fair statement. But one of the biggest changes, and it's not one that's commonly known, is that in Game 1, Coach Sinden, 2 things to this. One is, at that time, the NHL and in this series, they only had 17 skaters and 2 goalies for the lineup. So you didn't have the advantage of being able to have 12 forwards and 6 defensemen, which is a nice even number, because then you have 4 lines of 3 forwards and you have 3 sets of 2 defensemen. In this series, though, you only had 17, so you had to give up either a forward or a defenseman. So in Game 1, Coach Sinden decided to go with just 5 defensemen. That was a critical error. One of the players, in fact, Rod Steelian, went to Coach Sinden and begged him to play 6 defensemen. He said, "I've played against these guys." He had played with, I believe, with the national team earlier on, and he knew what these guys were capable of in the skating, and he felt that they needed all hands on board on defense. Unfortunately, going with 5 defensemen really made it inconvenient to try and have pairings. And the defensemen were exhausted. They were overplayed. And in Game 2, they went with 6 defensemen, which was a positive move. And they brought in Stan Mikita, Serge Savard, Bill White, Pat Stapleton, J.P. Parise, and Cashman, all very well-known names, I'm sure, to many hockey fans. And they, simply put, they were probably better matched against the Soviets than some of the players they had put out in Game 1. And as you said, they were viewed as exhibitions. Nobody, hey, people have given up their summer. They deserve a chance to play against the Soviets. all of a sudden it became, no, we have to ice our best team possible and try and win these games because we're in a lot of trouble. And the moves paid off. I call Game 2 probably the most NHL playoff game of the series. The intensity was very high. Canada knew we can't afford to go down 2 games in this series. And it was a very tight checking affair. And Dryden, who had a rough game in Game 1, was replaced by Tony Esposito, who was just, in my view, spectacular. He made some game-saving saves, as they say, and kept them in early when the game could have gone the Soviet way. And then Canada finally scored, opened the game up, scored another goal. There was a very famous shorthanded goal by Peter Mahovlich that's been seen by many people over and over. It's a beautiful goal, one of the best you'll see.
Over on the far side, right in front of the goal, went wide of the net. Zeman knocked it back to the goal. It rolls off to the side. They failed to clear it out. The point failed to get it away. Then Esposito cleared out. It's a race down with Peter Mahovlich going in on goal. Right in! He scores! Peter Mahovlich.
What an effort by Peter Mahovlich. What can you say? That Russian is still wondering where the puck is. Peter Mahovlich made an absolutely beautiful move. He has picked up the puck inside his red line. Now look at him isolate Polidyev. He gets him to put his legs together, isolates him, and then walks right around him. And what a move he made on Tretiak. Tretiak was completely fooled. Look at the move. He holds him with the big slap shot, walks around with the big reach. Now look at the move here. And holds it and jams it in the behind.
And the Soviets did get a goal, made it a little closer, but Canada punched in one more from Frank Mahovlich and won the game seemingly handily 4-1. One of the things that stands out with the 72 series that I feel is a bit of a misnomer is many people have said Team Canada was not in shape. Well, they didn't magically get in shape 2 days after Game 1 to win Game 2 4-1. I think the truth is we were not in Soviet game shape, but we never could be because we didn't train like that. But fortunately, now the series is tied, and things are looking up. But people were very concerned before this game. The tension's almost palatable amongst the crowd, and it was a great effort. It was kind of like the world had gone back to normal again.
Well, it almost seems explosive too, because again, if there was any sort of it also seems. So tell me about the end of the game, because the Soviet coach, right, was all over the refs and thought for sure that this was this American tandem calling the game were not calling it even-handedly and perhaps giving it away, if you will, to the Canadians. Maybe you can explain that a little bit, but also if there's any, it sort of belies any kind of. If this is even the term exhibition was even still in the lexicon after Game 2. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Russians were in this, the Soviets were in this to prove points and or win. And it seems like if people didn't sort of understand it, they certainly understood it by the shenanigans at the end of the game.
Well, there was certainly another event too. Harlamov kind of got very upset at one point and got a misconduct. They felt that, and I think it was Frank Larson and Steve Dowling, who I actually have met and is an amazing person. They felt that they were letting Canada get away with too much. But I honestly, in watching the game, I think it's just a tight checking, playoff-like game that was kind of the NHL's bread and butter. The players knew they had to slow the Soviets down. They knew they had to get in there and be physical with them. And simply put, the Soviets had never played a game like that. And they didn't like it. And they adjusted. I mean, if anything, the Soviet team, coaches, players were very quick learners. But I think, simply put, they just didn't like the level of physical play and the grittiness and that. And they took it out on the refs. And funny enough, they kind of made an agreement with Team Canada that those refs would not ref again, even though they were supposed to do Game 4, with the understanding that they would return the favor for Team Canada at some point, which really and truly they probably didn't. But I think it was just, they were probably just as embarrassed in a sense as Canada was after game one. But they'd lost handily.
All right, well, let's get into game three, because this really, so it's one game to one game. Great. But game three in Winnipeg, interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, it ends in a tie. And because this, I guess, was originally envisioned or officially still defined as an exhibition, there was, curiously, no provision for overtime.
That's correct.
But number two, it's also interesting, too, in that this was a game that the Canadians kind of let slip out of their hands, because they were winning multiple times during this game, and the Russians came back with some shorthanded goals at that.
Certainly been a number of close calls in this one at either end. Goalkeeping has really been tremendous. Petrov is ready for the face-off for the Soviet. Got the draw, but was knocked back to Bergman. Bergman is grabbed by Petrov and hauled down. The puck is in the corner. Bergman ran at his check. Petrov, and the puck is back in the corner. Mihailov covered, and the game is over. And it's ended in a 4-4 tie. Canada 4, the USSR 4. And that's a fair appraisal of a tremendous struggle. Two teams are tired, but put up a tremendous effort. But the final score, Canada 4 and the Soviets 4. This is game 3 from Winnipeg.
It was a very well-played game, and I think part of it was the Soviets adjusted. They knew what Canada was going, the style of play they were going to come out with. And they took advantage of, they had a breakout play that was even noticed by the Canadian scouts when they were there in August and over in the Soviet Union to watch some of the players. They mastered the bank shot, literally. On one play, Mikhailov makes absolutely, world-class pass from like his goal line. From the corner and banks it off the boards, and Harlamov picks it up just before center and goes in on a breakaway. And that goal was critical. Canada was in control of the game. We were winning 3-1 at that point, and then he scores a beautiful goal. And it was shorthanded to boot. So, it was almost like Canada's like, just when we feel we're getting a leg up, they have this knack of coming back and finding a way to, get back into the game, and they did that constantly. Even when we went up 4-2, shortly after they scored their second goal, they scored two quick goals after that, and some of it was I call critical mistakes. Players, on one play, Phil Esposito kind of went into the corner to help his wing, Cashman, and then they managed to get a goal, and Cashman basically told them to stay where he belongs. And on another play, Cornway kind of got out of position. And some of that, I think, has to do with Team Canada had never played together before. The Soviet national team had played together, they had changed as they had different players over time, but the core of this team had been around for years. They knew themselves inside out. The Canadian players were a mishmash of pretty much every team in the NHL except for a few expansion teams. So you had a team that was still struggling to find its chemistry and flow against a team that knew exactly how one another played, and you gave them an inch and they took a mile type of thing. But it was a very good game. Again, the goaltending was, there was some excellent goals, super goaltending, but it was a sister kisser, as they say. So now we have one game won, they have one game won, and we have a game tied. So the drama's, continuing to build again.
But so that was, if there was an initial turning point in this series, it was certainly that, because it seemed to extend into Game 4 in Vancouver. And maybe you can describe the atmosphere both at the beginning of the game, say from the fans, as well as not only after what happened in the game, but afterwards, right? The way that this game sort of ended, right, and as the sort of the entree or the I don't know, boarding the plane to get to the series going to the Soviet Union, not the best way to leave your home series, for sure.
No, it was a shock for the players. BC, British Columbia, our further west province, is kind of has a mindset, I suppose, a little like perhaps California in the U.S. They're a little bit more independent, a little bit more, free-spirited, I guess. And for whatever reason, the Vancouver crowd they didn't seem to be too happy with how Team Canada had been playing. There seemed to be this air of criticism about our physical, what was kind of thought of as our overtly physical play, and the fact that maybe, hey, why aren't you winning this series handily? So the response and it actually started in the warm-ups where there were some boos from the crowd, and the team was very confused. They're like kind of looking around going, are we still in Canada anymore? It was a bad foot, to start off the game, and it really put the team in a bad mood, or kind of a doubtful mood, because here they are, they're giving up their summer, they're playing for their country, and we're getting booed by our own crowd. And this was before the game started. And as the game went along, a few things happened. One was, for whatever reason, Sinden decided to go with only 3 centers. And so you had a kind of a tired Esposito, who had played 3 games in a row, a very tired Bobby Clark, who struggled this game. And then they brought in young Gilbert Perreault, who played very well, but he wasn't played, say, as regularly as some of the other centers. So that kind of hurt the team, I think. Again, it was these lineup adjustments. The Game 4 lineup for Canada resembled in a lot of ways their Game 1 lineup, and we all know how well that went. It just didn't seem to be an effective lineup against the Russians. So it was a combination of things. Bill Goldsworthy went in the lineup for Cashman, took a couple bad penalties. The Soviets scored power play goals, and the crowd booed. And I think that's kind of the way I'd sum up the game. We were never really in it. We scored a late goal to kind of, lessen the blow, but the 5-3 loss was not our best game. And even worse was we were leaving Canada down 2-1 with 1 tie and going to their home ice. And it was looking very, very dark at that point. And it was funny enough, it was going to get worse. Game 4 was also a turning point, though. As you say, the post-game, Phil Esposito actually vowed to become one of the game stars because he wanted to be in post-game interview, and he was. He got interviewed by CTV, who was carrying that game, and he kind of, put his heart out there. He said how hard the team was playing, they were trying their best, and they were shocked that they weren't getting the support from Canadian fans. And it was kind of like a call out to the country, and as well, it was, I think, in a way, a cry for support. We're in trouble here, and we need, maybe we need a pat on the back as opposed to a kick in the butt type of thing.
For the people across Canada, we tried, we did our best, and for the people that boo us, geez, all of us guys are really disheartened, and we're disillusioned, and we're disappointed in some of the people. We cannot believe the bad press we've got, the booing we've gotten in our own buildings, and if the Russians boo their players, if the Russians boo their players like some of the Canadian fans, I'm not saying all of them, some of them booed us, then I'll come back and I'll apologize to each one of the Canadians, but I don't think they will. I'm really disappointed. I am completely disappointed. I cannot believe it. Some of our guys are really, really down in the dumps. We know, we're trying, but hell, I mean, we're doing the best we can, and they got a good team, and let's face facts. But it doesn't mean that we're not giving it our 150%, because we certainly are.
Well, I think, Phil, the disappointment is a natural thing, because the whole thing was an unexpected thing. We all live with the National Hockey League. We've all been so proud over the years how great they are.
It's unexpected because of the press said that we were so good, or not one of us guys ever said we were good.
No, this is the thing. This is the thing that I'm, on behalf of the fans, I must say that probably, since everything is relative, we know how good you people are. The people didn't realize how good the Soviet team was, and now we found out how good they are. I think we can appreciate how good both teams are.
But I'll tell you, we love, I mean, every one of us guys, 35 guys that came out and played for Team Canada, we did it because we love our country, and not for any other reason, no other reason. They can throw the money for the pension fund out the window, they can throw anything they want out the window. We came because we love Canada. And even though we play in the United States and we earn money in the United States, Canada is still our home, and that's the only reason we come. And I don't think it's fair that we should be booed.
Well, Phil, I'm sure that the people can see from the sweat just pouring off your face that you and all your players have given 100%, and we look forward to some great games from you and the rest of your gang when you get over to Moscow, and we can wish you the very best of luck.
John,
keep working hard.
We're going to get better, I know.
Attaboy. Thank you very much, Phil.
Yeah, but it's also a metastasizing, I guess, of what was supposed to be an exhibition series, right, into something much, much more, right? So it feels to me like this series was taking on much more importance, even though it wasn't, designed to be that, right? And the drama sort of encircling around it. I mean, the press and the fans and all that kind of stuff. This wasn't, it seems, what the players, at least the Canadian players, maybe thought they were signing up for or being signed up for.
I completely agree. I think they felt abandoned. At that point, Team Canada, literally, they viewed themselves, they were an island amongst themselves. And it wasn't that they wanted it that way. They just felt that the country was against them. Obviously, the Soviets had them a little bit on the run, and they had to band together. It's kind of like a little bit, obviously not the same as being in a war, but there was a little bit of that war mentality that we have to stick together, otherwise all is lost. And so as difficult a moment in time it was, it also did resonate, and I think it still resonates now. It's if anybody were to watch Phil Esposito's speech, it's there on YouTube. It's very heartfelt, and this guy who's been the leading scorer in the NHL for a few years, along with Bobby Orr, he is profusely sweating. Like, if somebody had taken a bucket and poured it on him, I don't think he could be, look any sweatier than what he did. And that just kind of showed everybody, like, they're giving their best. They're out there trying, and they know they're in for a tough haul. So it did galvanize the team, and I think it started to open up the country to the fact that maybe we need to kind of be less critical and a little bit more open. Interestingly, if I may, I found a quote in the book Cold War that from the Soviet side of things, they were beyond the moon. They were ecstatic. And the quote is, "The series is lost for Canada. We have reached our objective, which was a win and a tie in the 4 games here. We'll wrap it up in Moscow no matter what happens in the Vancouver game." So this was a Soviet official to Montreal Star reporter John Robertson prior to the Vancouver game, which they ended up winning. So the Soviets, funny enough, if we can describe the series as Canada overconfident and the Soviets, unsure, by the end of Game 4, it was almost a complete flip. The Soviets were now perhaps getting overconfident, and Canada was, didn't know what was going to happen and didn't know quite how to, right the ship, as it were.
Right out of central casting, right?
Yes.
All right, so Game 5, right? So there's a 2-week hiatus, and let's set the tone as they get ready for 4 games in Moscow, which, unlike in the Canadian part of the series, are all going to take place in the same location, Luzinski. How do you say it? Luzniki? Luzniki Ice Palace, right? All in Moscow.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to why that was the case. Why not say in some other locations around the country? But there were also a bunch of Canadian fans that came along for the ride as well. Maybe you could sort of set the tone there. And I know there were some exhibition games even played in between this series by both teams prior to getting back on the ice 2 weeks hence.
Yes. I'll approach it chronologically. So Canada didn't immediately, play any additional games. There was a break, but they flew over to Sweden, and then they played 2 exhibition games back to back on September 16th and 17th. So when the series finished up the first half of the series finished up on September 8th, there was kind of a week to lick our wounds and kind of try and figure out what they were going to do next. So when they went to Sweden, they were meant to acclimatize the team. NHL size rink is 15 feet less wide than the international surface, which is 200 feet by 100 feet wide. So they wanted a couple of games to acclimatize themselves to the new rink with the expectation that they were going to be winning the series handily. Now these games became, very important. They needed to adjust to the big ice and get themselves ready for the second half of the series. The first game was somewhat uneventful. Tony Esposito played great in net. The team won fairly handily, 4-1, and the Swedes were described as being in awe of Canada. The second game turned into a debacle. Again, a lot of it's on YouTube. There was Cashman, according to reports, he took a stick in the mouth, which cut his tongue open. Other reports suggest he had got hit under the jaw and it bit his own tongue so badly he almost sliced it in half. It was a pretty nasty injury, and that was with a player, a Swedish player, Ulf Sterner, who had actually played in the NHL but in the minor system, and I think probably had a few grudges because he wasn't treated very well back in the 60s when he came over. And there was a stick swinging incident with Sterner and Dale Talon. It turned into a very ugly game. It ended up in a 4-4 tie. But suffice to say, Canada was primed for the last 4 games of the series. They were in a bad mood, as it were. They wanted to, play better, and they were determined to do so. The Soviet side of things is interesting. It's no book or anything I'd ever read ever said what were the Soviets doing for their 2 weeks. I managed to find in my research the Russians, they had started a Sovietsky sport tournament in August, and then they paused it in order to have the playoff round in their 2-week break. And the players who were on teams, because it was club teams in, from the Russian Hockey League, so some players weren't playing because they didn't make it to the playoff round, and they went on vacation. So you had this really odd dichotomy for the Soviet team where some of them were playing in this, kind of playoff series, which was in many ways a severe distraction. And you had other players sitting on beaches in Sochi. So very different approach, and it might explain why the Soviets kind of, maybe not the wheels fell off for them, but they weren't as quite the tight, cohesive unit that they had been in Canada, and that was their own, self-inflicted situation, if I can call it that.
Interesting, and you also mentioned not only the difference in the rink and getting acclimated to that, but and I don't know if this is the case in Sweden too, but the ice rink in Moscow also didn't have plexiglass, right? They were using netting, is that right? Or boards?
Yes. Stockholm did have glass. At that time in Moscow, it was this crazy mesh, kind of like what they use in the NHL now above the glass. They had no side glass. In fact, if you look at any of the footage of those games, if the puck goes above the boards, it's out of play. It was a very different situation, and the mesh would come to haunt Canada at times in Game 5 and in Game 8, where pucks that would probably have either rebounded much differently or even gone out of play in an NHL rink would get captured by this net and sprung back out like a slingshot. Very different, very, very unusual. And it certainly, I would say, gave the Soviets a bit of a home team advantage that NHL players, used to to glass for probably the last 50 years of NHL hockey.
That's in play. When that rebounds like that, that's in play. It's just like a rubbery rebounder kind of versus.
Exactly, and in lieu of glass, they had the mesh, and the mesh was literally, in play, absolutely kept in play, and it was probably a little higher than our glass too. So you had all these strange elements to it, but the biggest was, if it hit that mesh, you didn't know where it was going to go, and it would seemingly, if it hit it right, it would come out faster than it went in. So it was a highly unusual, kind of situation to deal with.
What was the pomp and, from what you could tell, what was the pomp and circumstance? And by the way, these games were being broadcast back to Canada and to certain stations in the United States too, if I'm not mistaken, right? These were syndicated airings of the game, I think even live, right? Back home?
Yeah. PBS picked it up in the U.S., and some showed it live, some showed it, tape delayed, but in some areas of the United States, fans were able to watch the entire Summit Series as well, which a lot of people don't realize. Canadians kind of think of it as, just us against them, but there were a lot of American fans who were interested in the series and rooting for Canada. There was a few rooting for the USSR as well. I know of a couple of friends who they like the Soviets, bluntly put, but and that's okay. In the end, everyone was fans of hockey. But what that allowed is a much broader audience worldwide. In fact, there were European countries broadcasting it, and I think maybe for the first time, the Soviet Union, in many areas of their country, not all of them, but in many areas, they were seeing a hockey tournament broadcast, and that had never been done before either. It was being broadcast live to them. There was no, nobody, pushing a button in case something happened that they didn't want the citizenry to see. But it allowed the series to gain even a bigger audience than it might have. And there's reports that maybe over 100 million people saw Game 8 when you add up Canada, the USSR, and the U.S. and other European nations.
What was the pomp and circumstance and the pregame festivities for this first game, Game 5, in the Soviet Union? Was it as drawn out and flourished as the Canadian version was? I do know from what I've read, which is obviously a mere skimming versus what you've been able to research in your book and your findings. They had all the political luminaries were there. I mean, Brezhnev was in there, and their premier was in there, and their heads of state and all that kind of stuff. So it would seem to me like this was sort of the Soviet version of the welcome to our country now kind of vibe.
Yeah, indeed. Like every game before Canada definitely had opening ceremonies. The ones in Moscow had theirs as well. And you're right, they had all the lead head communist figures up in their own box, peering down upon all the players and fans. So it was considered very important in the country, and probably more so because they were winning. And the ceremonies themselves very similar with regards to were introductions, but prior to the introductions, they had these lovely fans come out, not fans but skaters. They were probably figure skaters from Russian sports, and they brought out these flowers. And probably one of the most memorable moments of the series was as the players were being introduced. Phil Esposito, Canada's leading scorer and leader off the ice in many ways, he accidentally stepped on a pedal or a stem and basically landed right on his rump, right in front of those communist leaders and the entire world. But it was kind of it broke the ice literally in terms of the tension. Both teams broke out in laughter. And as a side note, Brad Park, who played with the Rangers, was bitter rivals with the Bruins. And just to show how much the team had kind of grown together, he actually came over to help Phil up off the ice in a true sign of, of Team Canada sportsmanship. But it was hilarious, there's no doubt about it. And Phil makes, nobody could do it better than Phil. Instead of being embarrassed, he started kissing, out to the crowd, ever the showman, as they say.
But the game, they reverted back to form, though, right? They had a commanding lead, the Canadians did, 4-1 in the third, and then gave up 4 straight unanswered goals to lose that game. Were they crestfallen at that point, or was it the fans that came from Canada, though, didn't seem to be, they seemed to be sort of behind the team and seemed like they were still, happy to be there and giving their support to the team, unlike what they left in Vancouver. What's sort of the aftermath of that game? I mean, was it like yet another game lost and all was sort of over, or did they feel like it was? What was that all about? Because you look at the stats, and this looks like it's completely insurmountable at this point, having lost that way.
I couldn't agree more. It was a shocker because they'd played so well. Funny enough, you mentioned the mesh, because Team Canada built almost a commanding lead, 4-1 with 11 minutes remaining, when a Soviet player, Anderson, made an incredible behind the legs, and he wasn't even facing the net. He deflected the puck facing his net the other direction into the top corner, and literally 8 seconds later they scored another goal. I think it went off one of the defenseman's skates. And what's interesting about the Anderson goal is that the puck had hit the mesh just before that, and probably would have gone out of play in a normal game, but it stayed in play. So everything kind of went wrong. Anything that could go wrong went wrong, and wasn't the goaltending of Canada. It was just crazy deflections, beautiful plays, and you're right. When we went from winning 4-1 and seemingly, insurmountable lead to losing 5-4, you might think that the team would have been absolutely crushed, but they went into the room. Funny enough, one of the players, I think it was Phil Esposito, said, it was at that point in time we knew we could beat them. Like, this game had gotten away from us due to a variety of circumstances, but they actually felt supremely confident, not overconfident, that they could somehow do what would seem the impossible, win 3 straight games on enemy ice in Moscow. But at that moment in time, at least to the fan at home, it seemed like it was over. Like, we'd already lost, and there was no coming back from this.
All right, so let's talk about Game 6, because this is really the height of the apex of the drama, because the Canadians scored a 3-2 victory, and it wasn't without controversy, and maybe we sort of get into it. We've mentioned Valery Kharlamov, probably arguably the Soviets' best player. You want to sort of describe this game, how a turning point happened, and what specifically happened that still, it's not only controversial, but just it was a turning point, and not everybody feels that it was sort of an incident of play, but perhaps it was a targeting kind of situation. What happened in Game 6?
Well, that's an accurate description, and I guess for Game 6, very tight game again. Ken Dryden came back in net. He had struggled, lost 2 games, but he played very well this game, and there was no scoring in the first period. Soviets opened up the game with a goal, and then we scored just like the Soviets scored 4 relatively quick goals in Game 5. We scored 3 very quick goals in a minute and 23 seconds in the second period to go ahead 3-1. And really, what's odd about the play that you're describing, which is the infamous slash by Bobby Clark on Valery Kharlamov's ankle.
3-1 for Canada as the puck goes back to Ragulin, number 5. They're 5 aside, both teams a man short. Soviets move to the attack at center ice. Kharlamov passes back. Here's a roller in front, a shot. Knocked down by Bergman, who fell in front of it. And there's going to be a penalty, I believe, on this one. Here's a mix-up. as the Soviet player shoved a bit. Now Bergman goes over to the Soviet player, threatens him a bit. That's Harlamov and Bergman. Well, that nearly started something. And as they don't understand English, it doesn't really mean whatever they're saying. But they're cooling them out. But there'll be penalties as a result of that. We'll see whether it's just Bergman or a player from each team.
Is that Canada was in control of, I'd say, Game 6, just like they had been in Game 5. In my mind, it was an unnecessary incident from every angle. One, highly unsportsmanlike. To, as described, hunt down one of their best players and to try and injure him. But as well, I think it hurt Canada because it ended up giving him a penalty that he had to serve. Canada got more penalties out of it. It got the Soviets back into the game. And they actually, Yakushev kind of stepped up. He was, in my mind, he's probably my favorite player off the Soviet team. He was a big man. Bobby Hull would describe him in the 1974 Summit Series as the best left winger in hockey. And he stepped into that gap because Harlamov was injured. He did keep playing, and Harlamov was also playing Game 8, but he wasn't the same. It's been reported when Clark hunted him down, slashed him, basically skated across half the ice to slash him for no apparent reason. He didn't break his ankle. I found out from Soviet hockey historians and friends that he had a severe hematoma, what we would call it now, a very deep leg bruise where you can imagine the whole leg is just black and blue and purple, and you can't skate on a leg very well that's being injured that badly. But it didn't change the fact that it was a very unfortunate play, infamous. It still resonates today. Me personally, I think it hurt Team Canada. I don't think it helped us. Yakushev absolutely went wild over the last 3 games, getting a lot of that ice time that probably Harlamov would have got. So I don't think we advantaged ourselves by knocking Valerie out of the play. As well, by getting the penalty, letting the Soviets back into the game. And here's the ultimate irony a lot of people may not know about Game 6 is the Soviets scored a second goal, and they actually scored what many consider to be a third goal, and it was by Harlamov. There was a power play near the end of the second period, and there was a pass made over to him, and it looks like he might have deflected it up into the net. But everything happened so quickly, and the Soviet nets are different than NHL nets. They had this inner mesh that kind of hung down behind the bar, and the idea was to help capture pucks, so pucks that went in the net would stay in the net. What seems to have happened on this play is that the puck was deflected upwards into the corner, and Dryden managed to scoop it out with his hand so quickly that the referee missed it. The goal judge missed it. But what's interesting on that particular play, if you go to the footage of that, the Soviet players are complaining. And that's one thing that Soviet players didn't do very often was vehemently complain to referees. They had a lot of respect for referees. They didn't like to argue with them. But several of the players were right up in the referee's face saying, that puck was in the net. It can't be confirmed definitively, but I suspect that there's a good chance it did go in, and that would have changed things dramatically because obviously they would have tied the game 3-3, and who knows what would have happened after that. Canada still might have won it, but we'll never know. So just a little side note on what how, as you said, what a turning point this game was because Valerie.
That's really interesting. But Harlamov is, arguably, I guess, to put it in perspective, I mean, this is sort of, he was like the king of players in the Soviet Union at that time, and arguably, and obviously he died tragically a few years later, 1981, in an automobile accident. But he was revered, and I don't know if he was the best ever player, but he's certainly lionized as being one of the country's best ever players. Not only after his passing, but during this period of time.
he was spectacular. He's very well remembered for fantastic goals, and in Game 1, Game 3 on a breakaway. Exquisitely skilled, very quick. One of those players. If I might make a slight comparison, how Connor McDavid can do everything at full speed. He just doesn't skate extremely fast. He doesn't handle the puck extremely well. He does both. And as good as, if you run down all the greatest players in history, it's a rare combination to have a player who's as fast a skater as he is a puck handler type of thing. And I think Valerie qualifies in that respect. He scored some incredible goals, some of the most memorable ones you ever saw in the 70s, in the 72 series, the 74 Summit series, even in the Super Series that was to come in late 75, early 76. An amazing player. Certainly his loss, we'll never know how much the team missed him. Would they have won if he didn't get hurt? I don't know. I honestly think that Yakushev, he exploded so incredibly. I think he might have had something like 5 points over the last 2.5 games. So, certainly losing Harlamov, it didn't help them, but I don't know if it necessarily hurt them because of how well Yakushev played. But it's a play, I'll sum up, it's a play that never should have happened, in the spirit and sportsmanship of hockey and other sports. You don't purposely injure your opponent on a non-hockey play. And he didn't even have the puck really at that time, so that kind of sums it up there.
Yeah, and Harlamov obviously missed Game 7, came back and not nearly at full strength for Game 8. But before we leave that incident and we go into Games 7 and 8, Clark apparently didn't do this on his own, per se. There seems to be controversy about whether he was
directed,
strongly suggested to do this by the bench.
Yes, Clark has said that the assistant coach on the team was John Ferguson, who was a known pugilist of the highest order in the 60s with the Montreal Canadiens. But he was a tough-nosed player, and he, Clark had said that it was kind of suggested to him. I think the way it was put to someone should go and tap him on the ankle, and Clark felt that the statement that was being made, that it was being made to him because most of the other players on Team Canada would not be inclined to do so. But I also read that John Ferguson Sr. later on said, no, I never said anything like that. So it's one of those things we may never know the truth on because we have conflicting statements on it. But Clark has admitted he's done it, and I think his famous kind of comments as if he had never learned to lay the lumber on somebody, he never would have got out of Flin Flon, Manitoba when he was a junior. So that kind of sums up, I guess, his outlook on it.
Yeah, it also sort of seems to explain away sort of physicality, and at the time, the Soviet teams didn't kind of fight really with each other. They sort of, I guess in his words, kind of got their points across in other ways, and I'm calling them cheap shots, but the physicality that that gets retaliated by, and arguably this is sort of maybe was his way. I don't know if he's defending himself, but certainly expressing it. Certainly,
absolutely, and we'll never quite fully know what it was like to be on the ice. One observation I came to realize watching so much of the footage is when the games were played over in Moscow, Canada was wearing their white jerseys. And if you look closely, it's amazing how many of the players, Ron Ellis comes to mind, had black marks all over their jersey, which would be the tape marks from the sticks from the Soviet players that were hooking, hacking, whatever towards him. So the Soviets were not physical in the way Canadians were. We were more, Canadian hockey tends to be more, I'm going to come up and I'm going to give you maybe a cross jack and I'm going to give you an elbow, but more obvious, I suppose, more direct. And I'm not advocating it or defending it, just that's kind of the style of play that that did exist back at the time. Soviet players tended to be a little more sly about theirs. There's numerous reports of being spit upon, Canadian players having them come up and spit in their face, which is kind of a hockey no-no. As well, if a guy is facing the boards, generally you're not supposed to come in and kind of cross-check him face first into the boards. So there's kind of a different code or coda, perhaps, that the Soviet players lived under. And, they did their thing and we did ours, and neither was right, I would say. And in the end, I still feel that play, I would like to have seen Harlamov play, simply for the fact that if you're going to beat an opponent, to me, you want to beat them honestly, for lack of a better way to put it. And I don't think the play was necessary in any stretch of the imagination. But as you said, for some players, that's how, that's kind of how they handled business back then. And I guess that's the way it was.
All right, another tight game ensued in Game 7, and incredibly, Team Canada finds themselves, after winning Game 7 4-3. Do you want to talk about briefly before we get into Game 8 and the sort of the exclamation point of all this, how that Game 7 was settled? Because we're in the third period, it's tied 3-3, and a pretty interesting goal gets scored near the end of that period to give it to the Canadians.
Oh, very interesting. And, Paul Henderson earned his name, rightfully so, in the 72 series by he conceivably could have been the game-winning goal scorer in Game 4, if depending on how that game had unfolded, because he did score the fourth goal, but he had scored the winning goal in Game 6. So you come to Game 7, and there's two things that stand out for me in Game 7. One is Tony Esposito was absolutely spectacular again. Without him, I honestly don't think we win the series. As much as Dryden is remembered, rightfully so, for winning Game 8. Game 7, Canada seemed to be a little bit maybe tired, or they weren't as on their game as much. And Tony Esposito played incredibly well. And I think full credit to him for allowing, the team to right the ship, as it were. And so what happens is you go into about the last 4 minutes of the game, and they're tied 3-3. And there's an incident that possibly ties into Game 6 with Harlamov's injury. The play I'm speaking of is that Bergman and Mikhailov get tied up behind the Canadian net. And what happens is that Mikhailov starts kicking Bergman with his skates. Now, you can't really see it in the game footage. It's unclear, but there are other angles that have been shown over the years. And he kicked him so hard, apparently he kicked him right through his plastic, the plastic front of his shin pad, and cut his knee. So if there's any no-no in hockey, one is slashing an opponent's ankle for no reason. Two is kicking an opponent with your skates. So what I find interesting on that play is I wonder if the game would have ended up tied if it had never happened, because all heck broke loose when that incident occurred. The game got delayed by several minutes. Bergman got major in roughing, so did Mikhailov. And by the time the dust settled, they were 4-on-4. And basically what happens is a minute later is arguably one of the greatest goals I've ever seen, which is Henderson basically gets the puck and moves up past the two Soviet forwards, manages to squeeze past the two Soviet defensemen, and as he's being hip-checked to the ice by Vasilyev, managed to kind of hook the puck, snap it into the top corner past Tretiak. Absolutely incredible goal at a crucial time.
They're 5 aside, 2:20 left in the game, a 3-all tie. Puck goes into the corner, Lapointe shooting it back to the net to Savard. Savard is trying to get out, lobbed it ahead. Henderson going down, got to the defense, goes right on his goal, he scores! Henderson, right through the score for Canada. A beautiful goal by Paul Henderson. Henderson makes a beautiful move on this goal, and he's
being mobbed by his teammates. But this is an absolutely beautiful move by Henderson. And the goal judge was a little slow in putting the light on, but there's no question that puck was right up into the top and the back of the net. And Tretiak really had no chance on that quick little maneuver by Paul Henderson.
And now you have a Game 8 where Canada has the potential to win the series. So outstanding play, amazing moment.
Who could have ever imagined that after all of this, that we would be in a Game 8 and the series would be tied? I mean, you could not have scripted this any better. And from what I read, it almost I mean, you were hinting before about how the international audience and attention for this thing. I read a little bit about how various folks all across Canada were almost treating this like it was like a mini holiday, sort of either to take off work or in anticipation of this game, a gathering in train stations and watching, it's almost like an Olympic final of some sort or some kind of national, fervor around this. That's literally how much this was an event, not only in Canada, but in certain pockets of the world, just how important this supposed exhibition was becoming with this now tie-breaking, supposedly, Game 8.
It was the ultimate in drama, as you say. It was, Canada's supposed to win every game, and then it looks like we're going to lose. And then it looks like we have no chance of winning. And then somehow there were signs put up, Mission Possible, kind of a play on the TV series Mission Impossible, which was Canada was not to be denied. So the fact that, Henderson scoring in Game 7 tied the series at that point, and it's anybody's game for Game 8. But Game 8, it kind of stands above all, and in my mind, it is still the most amazing, hockey game I've ever seen, just for pure drama, for controversy, for exciting, inexplicable moments. And you're right. You've got a worldwide audience, estimated 100 million. I believe it was something like between radio and TV, they figured that there could have been upwards of 16 million Canadians out of 21 million that were in the country at the time that were watching or listening to it. We were joined together in a way that Canadians probably had never been, outside of maybe fighting in a world war and having that kind of bond. So it was exciting. It was, I believe, the game started 12:30, so it was in the afternoon of a workday, and I was at school. I think grade 2 perhaps, and back then we had these TVs up on these stands, standing like probably 6 feet in the air, and like a 21-inch black and white. And we were allowed by our teacher in the school to watch the game in school, and it was, I still remember it. I may have been young, but absolutely, incredible moment. Never will forget it. And in summary, the game had everything. You had moments of, I'm trying to think of the right terminology. The game started out with questionable refereeing. You had a Canadian player look like he was going to club one of the referees in front of a live worldwide audience. The refereeing settled down after that. They started playing hockey, and it went back and forth and back and forth. And then the Soviets got ahead of us 5-3 by the end of the second period. And that mesh came into play again on us, where one of the shots hit the mesh, missed, bounced back to a Soviet player, and he banked it in the net. So we're sitting there, 20 minutes to play, 7 games and 2 periods gone, and losing by 2 goals. It doesn't look good. It looks like we've gone this far only, to not be able to reach our objective. And then the third period starts, and Canada scores early, gets us back into it. Just over about 7 minutes left to play. There's a huge, play in front of the Soviet net. Everyone's batting at the puck and falling down and that, and Canada scores again to tie the game. And then you have another incredible dramatic moment where the goal light doesn't go on. And the person who's the goal judge is, in fact, a Russian referee of later years. We see him in the 74 series and 76 series. And Eagleson, in his, in his anger or excitement, jumps down out of his seat and lands on some Soviet military guards because he wants to go talk to the goal judge about the fact that he hasn't put the goal light on. And so what happens is Team Canada is celebrating, and all of a sudden, a lot of the team skates over to the one side of the rink, and they start swinging their sticks at the military guards. Because what's happened is when Eagleson jumped out of his seat and landed on them, they start arresting him, and they start hauling him out of the arena. And one of the players sees that happening and skates over, and they start jumping over the boards. They start whacking the officials, and they get him back.
Park is trying to come out on the left side. A long pass to Phil Esposito going in. He shoots. Oh, right in front of the net. Esposito banged that. Here's another shot by Cornwallis. His goal! Canada have tied it up. The Canadian team grabbing each other there as the loose puck went around the net. And Canada tied it finally 5-5.
Esposito makes an incredible individual effort on this goal. I can't say enough. Look at him fight for the puck. He gets it back out in front of the net after having missed it once himself. And I believe it's Ivan Cornwallis who gets the goal. Phil Esposito, once, he digs for it now and he keeps fighting. He gets it out. It's shot. And Cornwallis puts the backhander into the goal. Now we see a fight breaking along the boards.
Mixed up on the far side. The Canadian team are mixing it up with the spectators, and I believe Alan Eagleson is in on it over there as far as we can tell. And the Canadian team are all over there. When that rumpus started, whatever it was, nobody knows. But Canada tied that score at 12:56, and it appeared to be Cornwallis who got the goal. There's a wild scramble around the Soviet net. Apparently, the police were trying to throw Eagleson out, and that's when the reserves from the Canadian team came over there to help out.
And there on live TV, you see him being escorted across the ice, hands being thrown up in the air with the various digits being exposed. And as you said, you couldn't write this stuff. And it's all happening in front of the highest communist officials in the Soviet Union.
That's wild. And it's so why was the goal light not lit? Was it just was that on purpose, or was it sort of to be sort of a kind of just to irk the Canadians and maybe kind of sort of diffuse maybe something, whatever, the drama. I mean, or was it? I'm just curious as to why that was, why it wasn't lit. And did the players keep playing, or was it ruled a goal on the ice, or what?
It was, I believe, it was ruled a goal. So there was no doubt about it. And the referee was the infamous Victor Drombowski, well known for, I guess, not being necessarily the most objective referee in hockey history. But I do recall him being asked about it, and his response was, flick the switch and light no work, or something along those lines, which is pretty amusing considering it worked before and after, even on the game-winning goal. I think you're probably right. It was him maybe going, if I don't turn on this light, maybe they won't notice. But it did set off a whole series of fireworks that just were remarkable for live TV.
Well, and you can imagine it only just spurred the Canadians that much further. Frankly, you can make the argument that maybe that that only just got them more peaked and outraged.
Up. Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I was just going to mention another thing that happened was as the game resumed, so it's now tied 5-5, and we still have, enough time left in the game, just over 7 minutes to play. And in the background, you can see Soviet military guards walking in behind the benches by the dozens, if not the hundreds. So whether that was done to, kind of for crowd control or to psych out the players, to send a message, I don't know. But it is a bit unnerving when you see it, because it kind of suggests, you better not do anything else, or and even some of the Canadian players were not sure, are we going to get out of here when this is all said and done? Are they going to throw us, in a gulag? So interesting moments, that's for sure.
All right, so true to the movie's form, we're talking down the last minute of the last game. Everything's tied up. The game is tied. The series is tied. Again, you couldn't write this any better. Take us through that final minute. It's called The Goal in Canadian lore, and I guess for good reason.
Yeah, you had Canada attacking the Soviet zone in waves. They're desperate to, they're not satisfied just to tie. Just another side note, a Soviet official came over to the Canadian bench to tell them that if the game ended tied, they were going to declare themselves the victors of the series. So all of the coaches, all of the players are like, we can't just tie this game, even though, that would, a tie in the series would be maybe at that point, a well-earned result. They realized we're going to have to win this. We're going to have to score another goal. And so they're pressing as hard as they can, but the clock is ticking down. So what happens on this, this famous play is that Henderson wasn't out on the ice at the time, but he said later he felt this sense that he had to go out there, he had to be there, and he actually called Peter Mahovlich off the ice. He was yelling at him, Peter, this isn't the coaches saying this. This isn't anybody else but Paul Henderson going, I have to get back on that ice, and I have to get that back out there now. So Peter Mahovlich comes off the ice, Henderson jumps on, and Cornway fires the puck kind of cross laterally into the left corner of the Soviet zone. And what's interesting, and I find this, it's one of those moments in time where you kind of look at it and it hits the boards and almost comes at an exact angle along the Soviet goal line, and the Henderson goes charging in to get the puck, and he gets hooked, and he literally spins around like a top and crashes into the boards. And the Soviet player, he goes to get the puck, and he fumbles it. And then, so he never actually gets any full control of it. Phil Esposito whacks at the puck, and it's right between at Tretiak's pads. In that instant, Henderson got up, got back to the front of the net, and gets that loose puck. And what happened is both Soviet defensemen, for some reason, kind of converged on the same side of the ice. So now there's nobody in front of Tretiak. And you've got Paul Henderson all alone, takes a shot. Tretiak saves it. And Tretiak's now down and out, and the Soviet defenseman is racing across to try and hook or get a hold of Henderson. And just as he gets to him, Henderson manages to flip the puck past Tretiak's outstretched arm, or under it. It's a little hard to tell, into the net. 34 seconds left in the game, and Canada's just scored the winning goal. It takes your breath away, I guess, in a sense. And Foster Hewitt called the winning goal in his high-pitched little voice he had, and it was just sheer excitement. And across the country, Canada explodes.
And the Cornwallis has it on that wing. Here's a shot. Henderson made a wild stab for it and fell. Here's another shot. Right in front of the score. Henderson has scored for Canada. Henderson right in front of the net. And the fans of the team are going wild. Henderson right in front of the Soviet goal with 34 seconds left in the game. An absolute
Yeah, and I guess overshadowed in all that is Esposito, and having sort of instigated the formation of that goal, also had a pretty damn good game overall too, to kind of keep them in the game and arguably punctuate his contribution to the series too. But no doubt, I mean, the Henderson goal certainly is probably the exclamation point of this, and it's. Let's wrap this up because this is, this is just, this doesn't even do it justice, right? And there are bunches of other books, and I know there's a lot of other documentaries and stuff. And Lord knows I got to now probably watch all these games, and shame on me for not doing so from YouTube prior to this conversation. But can you somehow put all of this into context, especially for either Canadians of a current generation that weren't around at the time, or maybe have only heard this in spurts, or maybe don't even know about sort of the importance of this, and or the American fan or sports enthusiast who perhaps because of the arrogance of being an American doesn't sort of understand the importance of what this meant to the Canadian psyche generally, as well as sort of their pride in being a hockey and the hockey nation, I guess, of the world.
Oh, I'd be glad to do so. And in fact, just before I take that on, did want to agree with you that Phil Esposito arguably played the greatest period of hockey by any Canadian hockey player, maybe any player in an international game in history. He had a goal and 2 assists. He willed Canada to victory in that game, down 5-3, win 6-5. He was the face of the team by that point. And we, as a country, I think I have the advantage of being able to describe what it meant to Canada because the U.S. has enjoyed an amazing moment as well, in a different circumstance, but in a similar situation. For the U.S. winning the 1980 Olympics, defeating the Soviets 4-3, the Miracle on Ice. Our Miracle on Ice was the Summit Series, and it's a defining moment, and it carries so much gravitas for us. The older generation, the younger one, probably has a bit of difficulty seeing it in the same way because international hockey is now ubiquitous; it's everywhere. But in a lot of ways, it's because of the Summit Series helping carve that path. It was expected to be, a walkover, and it turned into high drama of the highest order. And there's no taking away the importance of the game from so many angles, for hockey history, for international relations, because even though there was still a Cold War going on for the next 2 decades, it really did help create a connection. The Soviet players were recognized for being great hockey players, not just amateurs, but great hockey players in their own right. Canada was being, seen as being, why are we the top hockey nation? Because we find a way to win, even if it's 3 games in a row on Soviet ice. Even Russian fans today still speak in awe of that because it just shows the desire and the will to win, and that's very much how Canadians and Americans are a lot alike in that regard. And that U.S. Olympic team wasn't necessarily expected to win. A bit different perspective, but if anybody who's listening wants to find a comparator, I'd say, how do you feel about the U.S. winning in 1980 and not just beating the Soviets but the Finns for the gold medal, and then that sense of pride, and that's how I would describe it. You just amazing elation, incredible relief, and a sense of pride that has never left me. I still get chills. I still get chills thinking about it because it was such a special moment in time.
Holy mackerel. That's a story and then some. All that video is available on YouTube. Every one of the games, all those 8 games, is available. The original CBC broadcasts, some snippets of which you heard embedded in our conversation with Rich, featuring the great Foster Hewitt calling the play-by-play, and former player and sideman Brian Conacher. The history of the broadcasts were also very interesting too. If you grew up in the Northeast, and watched this series, you may remember different voices. Well, that's because WSBK, Channel 38, an original superstation up in Boston, actually produced the first 4 of those games, the ones that were in Canada, with their own announcers. I think it was the Bruins announcers, as a matter of fact, Fred Cusick and John Pearson on the call. The latter 4 games, though, fell through, and PBS stations across the country in the United States wound up picking up that CBC feed. So Messrs. Hewitt and Conacher were certainly known entities here in the States, as well as, of course, all across Canada. But all those games are there. I'll be probably deep diving into all of them. The movie that you had the clip from the beginning of the show, once again, is called Cold War on Ice, Summit Series 72. That originally appeared on NBC Sports Network back in 2012. I know it's been on NHL Network on occasion, and I just don't know where one can find it. It possibly could be in the new Peacock streaming service in the sports realm there. Maybe the NHL.com has a DVD of it. I'm not sure. But keep an eye and ear out for it. Set your DVRs or fire up your TiVo or whatever to record it when it comes out, because that's a hell of a film as well. But regardless of what you do to watch and sort of learn more about the story, make sure that you run, not walk, to your favorite bookseller, whether that be Amazon or elsewhere, to get Rich's great book. It is the ultimate companion in terms of stats and intrigue and stories and all kinds of things that go beyond the narrative and the actual play of the game itself. It's literally a compendium of every single kind of fact you would ever want to know about what was going on, literally through the entire, the before, the during, and the after of this series. Again, the book is called 1972, the Summit Series. Canada versus the USSR, Stats, Lies, and Videotape, the untold story of hockey's series of the century. Of course, we encourage you to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Rich Bendell, and just click the link there for the book, and you will be whisked away to Amazon, and you'll be giving us a few shekels of love for the holidays to keep our lights on and our coal burning, so to speak. Sorry, that's not very carbon friendly. The wood burning fire. How about that? Yes. We'd like to continue to bring you more episodes next year for sure. And we'd love to help pay some bills with that. So we appreciate that. Before we wrap up, I do want to tell you that if you want to not only buy the book, you can also follow Rich out there on internet land. On Twitter, you can find him at 72, the number 72, Series Bendell, Bendell, 2 L's, at 72 Series Bendell. You can find him on Facebook at facebook.com/72series. And he even will accept your emails at thesummitseries1972 at yahoo.com. So there you go. Buy the book and follow Rich, and I believe some more updates to this book and the stories around it are to come. For us, our website, again, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the place where you can find every episode that we've ever done and will continue to do. You will find all of our social media feeds. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on Facebook as well, for as long as we hang out there. Not much longer, we think. What else? You want to send us email? Go ahead. hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We look forward to your emails. We try to respond to all of them. Our apologies for being backed up, but we will get to them. What else? You want to get to our email newsletter? You can do that too. Just search for the little tab on the website, and you could just give us your email and your name, and we will get you signed up for that weekly missive that we send usually every Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. What else? Jerry Payne. He's the man with the twiddling knobs, the editorial goodness that he does for us each and every week. Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. Say it loud, say it proud. I think that is it for this week. We appreciate your listening to no end. Hope again the holiday season continues to go well for you, and more fun stuff coming at you next week. Thanks for listening. As always, we appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.